Welcome to Conversations. This is your host, Michael Stone, and I'm very excited about today's guest. He's been on KVMR before, and it's Gregg Braden. Gregg is a 5-time New York Times best-selling author and is internationally renowned as a pioneer in bridging science, spirituality, and human potential. From 1979 to 1990, Gregg worked for Fortune 500 companies, including Cisco Systems, Phillips Petroleum, and Marietta Aerospace, as a problem solver in times of crisis. He continues problem solving today as he weaves modern science and the wisdom preserved in remote monasteries and forgotten text into real-world solutions. His discoveries have led to 12 award-winning books, now published in over 40 languages. Gregg has shared his presentations with the United Nations, Fortune 500 companies, and the US military, and he's now featured in media specials airing on major networks throughout the world. He's the 2018 nominee for the prestigious Templeton Award, established by the late Sir John Templeton to honor outstanding individuals who have devoted their talents to expanding our vision of human purpose and ultimate reality. The United Kingdom's Watkins Journal lists Gregg among the top 100 of the world's most spiritually influential living people for the 5th consecutive years. And we're here to talk about his new book, Human by Design: From Evolution by Chance to Transformation by Choice. Gregg, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be with you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I especially like the living part about the award. It's given to a living person. That's
much
good
better than being dead and getting an award, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, and thank you for showing that beautiful book. I don't have one in front of me, but it's the first time I've seen it on the cover coming back to me through a Zoom video, and it actually looks very beautiful.
Good. I'm glad I didn't hold it upside down like I did with Kyle Cease. Of course, that was appropriate.
I'm sure Kyle was perfectly okay with it.
Well, the name of the book was I Hope I Screw This Up. So I loved your book, and I want to start out just talking about the age-old question, which you start your book with: who are we?
Sure.
And how does that question define our world?
Well, that's a very big question. That could be our whole interview today.
Probably.
You know, I'm just going to begin by saying this: the better we know ourselves, Michael, the better equipped we are for whatever change the universe brings to our doorstep. The better we know ourselves, the less we fear change in our lives. The better we know ourselves, the less we fear one another. And I think perhaps the most important thing we're discovering here is the better we know ourselves, the less we fear ourselves, the less we fear the power that the new science is telling us lies at our fingertips to shift the world from the separation and conflict and competition that we've seen in the past to a world of cooperation. So I think this is an important foundation. It was a foundation for this book. We are steeped, we as a society, maybe not you and me and maybe not every one of our listeners, but as a society, we are steeped in a story, a scientific story, when it comes to the question, who are we? And it's a story, it's a very sterile sounding story of evolution, Darwin's idea of evolution, a random process that happened under extremely rare combination of just the right conditions at just the right period of time, bringing together just the right elements to create just the right atoms, or just the right atoms create just the right elements and the right molecules, and the most primitive forms of life. And then we have evolved slowly, gradually over long periods of time to what we have become today. This is the story that's being taught in our schools today. It's a story you and I were taught when we were kids. I was growing in school in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. And the problem with the story, number one, is the evidence no longer supports it. Number two, is it is a very sterile sounding story that takes the value and the meaning out of life, out of human life. And this is the answer to your question, Michael. This is why I think this is so important. In the presence of the world of change, we're also living in a world of tremendous hurt and tremendous hate. And the hate is not just an American phenomenon. The hate based in the color of our skin, the hate based upon our religious beliefs, upon our sexual orientation. The cyberbullying that we hear about in America is happening in other parts of the world as well. The willingness to take a human life so easily because the value of the life has been devalued through the story that we have been told. I'm just going to tell a quick story. I mean, I'm beating around the bush, and I might as well just tell the story. I recently came back from leading a group through a 3-week journey in Peru and the high Andes of southern Peru. And while we're in those Andes mountains, I don't watch any news at all. You know, we're completely cut off from the outside world. So when I came back to the US, I came in through the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, and I was making my way to my domestic gate to fly back to my home here in New Mexico. And as I went down the concourse, I was hearing the news feed that was playing at each gate and getting a fast catch up on all the news that I'd missed while I was out of the country. It was a very scary experience, because I was hearing about the things that I just mentioned here. It was about the hate crimes. It was during last summer is when the hate crimes were so prevalent in the media, and the hate crimes perpetrated by ISIS in the Middle East, and the opioid addiction, and the record numbers of drug abuse here in our country, and teenage suicides. And I got to my plane and I sat down. I was just reeling from what I was hearing. But here's the thing: there was as different as every story was from one another, there was a common denominator, and that's what this book is really all about. And the common denominator is this: that all the things that I had heard were only possible because of the way we've been taught to think about ourselves and about one another. We have been conditioned to believe this story that we live in a world that's based upon separation, competition, conflict, struggle, scarcity. Dog eat dog is the way that it was put to me when I was in school. I was taught that I live in the dog eat dog world. And the problem with that is, I'm not even saying it's a conscious issue, but subconsciously, those beliefs play such a primal role in the way that we live every day of our lives, and the way we treat the people we share our home with, and the people we share our bed with. I mean, you know, we just get real about this. The most intimate relationships are based upon the way we've been taught to think about ourselves. And we solve our problems, we live our lives, we heal our bodies, and we create our relationships based upon the way we answer that question: who am I? So what's happening is the world is changing. And that means your life is changing, my life is changing, our listeners' lives are changing. And we're trying to address the change through a way of thinking that was introduced over 150 years ago in 1859 by Charles Darwin, and principles that we know are no longer true, and they're not working. So that's why I think that the value of the new discoveries, and that's what this book is about as well, the new discoveries that tell us that we're not what we've been told in the past, we're more than we've ever imagined. And the discoveries are based on rock solid science, Michael, that simply is not trickling down into the mainstream. You're not seeing what I call pop science. You're not seeing this in the pop science of the cable news networks. You're not seeing it on the airport newsstands. Behind the scenes, the hardcore scientists are publishing these discoveries in very obscure technical journals that very few people have the opportunity to see on the one hand. And on the other hand, they change the way we have been taught to think about ourselves and give us the tools that we need to embrace change in a healthy way in our personal lives as well as collectively in our global lives. So it's a long answer to a short question, but I wanted to.
Good answer.
Yeah.
I don't think people really recognize that we live inside of a story, and that story is in some ways living us. And it's not only the Darwinian, but it's the Cartesian Newtonian paradigm of objects in a world of objects. And
Sure.
I was really interested and fascinated by your analysis of Darwin's origin of the species, because first of all, that we take it granted. Talk about the evidence that challenges that and supports the new theory that's emerging from your work and other people's work.
Well, thank you, Michael. First, I'll begin by saying I am a scientist. I'm a degreed geologist with a very strong background in the life sciences. So molecular biology, molecular chemistry, invertebrate paleontology, vertebrate paleontology as a geologist. And the reason I say that is because it's given me the tools to look into these obscure technical and scientific publications and see what is being discovered. The problem is the scientists, they simply don't have a platform beyond their obscure technical journals. from which
Not
to share.
funded either
Yeah.
for on purpose. Yeah.
Well, that may be part of it. And the discoveries, so I'm saying this because what I'm about to share with our listeners and with our viewers, it's not a Greggism. It's not my theory or my hypothesis. This is the new story that's emerging. And there is a new human story. It's a beautiful story. It's a powerful story of hope and possibility. And I'm saying, as a scientist, this is so very different from what I was led to believe, when I was in the universities and even in the corporations. So
What's amazing, Greg, is that it's still taught in the schools as
well,
though it's fact.
this is what I was going to say. Even though the science has told us that the old story, Darwin's theory of evolution, when it applies to humans, even though the new discoveries are telling us it's not our story, it's being taught as fact in the classrooms, in the textbooks, and anything that challenges that story is simply not allowed. So what's happening, I'm just going to draw a distinction here for our viewers and our listeners. There's a powerful difference between creating a theory, which Darwin did in 1859, and it was a good theory. It was a different world in 1859, and it was a good theory that he created for the time. So there's a big difference between creating a theory and attempting to force every iota of evidence to fit into that theory, even when it doesn't fit, like a square peg in a round hole. There's a big difference between doing that and allowing the evidence to lead to whatever story it's going to tell. So we live in a society where the former is happening, where all of the evidence is being forced into this theory that Darwin called evolution by natural selection, slow, gradual changes over a long period of time, even when that evidence doesn't fit. So I want to be very clear. As a geologist, evolution is a fact. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I've seen the evidence in the fossil record for many forms of life, for many forms of animal, for plants, for insects. It breaks down when it comes to humans. And I'm going to say also right off the bat, I don't know what the answer is. Scientists don't know what the answer is. And that's the whole point of why I've offered this book as an invitation to free our young people who are in school right now, about to dedicate their lives to solving the greatest mysteries of our existence, to free them from the shackles of a story that has come to a dead end, a story that's no longer supported by the evidence, so that they can find what that new evidence is. So for many people, when you say evolution is not the story, they think it's binary. If it's not evolution, somehow religion has come into this. I don't know what the answer is. I have my personal opinions. I'm going to talk about that as we go through this. But the evidence is where it's telling the story. And the evidence is in two categories: the physical evidence, which has been around since 1859, or actually not been around. Since 1859, the controversy has been, where's the physical evidence? And even Darwin acknowledged that. He said, if my theory is true, we should see evidence everywhere, and we don't. And he said, that's one of the big problems with my theory. He acknowledged that.
Yeah.
But why, if the new science of DNA and the new DNA evidence had not become available, even as recent as the last 5 years, I wouldn't have written this book. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But what's happened is what used to be science fiction is now science fact. For example, I think many of our viewers and listeners are familiar. There was a movie, Jurassic Park, the first Jurassic Park, that came out a few years ago. That was science fiction, where scientists were taking the DNA from fossilized remains of ancient forms of life. And in the movie, they brought the DNA, they reconstituted those forms of life. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't gone quite that far, but here's science fact right now, is we now have the ability to extract the DNA from the fossilized remains of the beings that we have been taught are our ancestors, that we've been taught we descended from. And we can compare their genome to ours, and the story it's telling is like a seismic shock wave that is rocking the world of anthropology and evolutionary biology, because the DNA says that those forms of life that we see on the evolutionary trees of life, where you see humans at the top, and these lines that connect us to Neanderthal and Australopithecus and Lucy and these other forms of life, the DNA is telling us that they are our ancestors, that we did not descend from those forms of life. And you can see this if you go to the really honest evolutionary trees of life, such as at the Smithsonian Institute, for example, or the encyclopedia. So the Britannica Encyclopedia will show this very clearly. The lines that connect us, modern humans, we as modern humans, those other forms of life, they're shown as broken lines. And the legend on the chart says these are inferred or speculative relationships. They are believed to exist. However, there is no physical evidence that has yet been found to support them. And the scientists explain that by saying, well, we just haven't looked in the right place. After 150 years of the greatest minds and the most prestigious scientific institutions and the most sophisticated technology, that we have yet to find one iota of physical evidence that makes those links factual. So that has always been a problem. But the new discoveries now are telling us how deep that problem goes. So this is where the DNA comes in.
One of the most exciting things for me in this book is the mystery of the fused DNA. And I'm really interested in your expanded interpretations of what happened there. 200,000, was it 200,000 years ago?
It is. Well, you've got a good memory. You read the book.
Oh, I read every page of it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So if our viewers and listeners, if you're still with me now after everything I've just said, when it comes to the DNA, I'm just going to begin with a story. 1987, a discovery was made in Northern Europe, deep in the earth. The body of a Neanderthal baby girl was discovered, a Neanderthal infant. If you have followed, the science that you were taught when you were in school and I was taught as well, Neanderthal has always been believed to be, we were descended from Neanderthals. They were our ancestors. The discovery was made in 1987. This infant was preserved in such a rare state, it's never been seen before and never since, that her DNA, and specifically the DNA in her rib cage, this is where the DNA was extracted. This is where science fiction now has become science fact. We're able to extract the DNA from the fossilized remains of these beings that are believed to have descended from, reconstitute their genome and compare it to ours, and it's telling us that we didn't descend from them, they're not our ancestors. So this is one of the places, this Neanderthal infant was one of the first places where this occurred. Now the discovery was made in 1987. The results of the studies, listen to this, they were not even published until the year 2000. And when they were published, it was in a very prestigious journal. It's called Nature, volume 404, the year 2000. I believe is on page 490 is where the studies, the results began. And the bottom line is, what the scientists said, is that there's not enough overlap between our DNA and Neanderthal DNA to suggest that we have descended from them. As a matter of fact, it shows that we walked the earth with them. We shared the earth with them. We probably interbred with them. They say we probably had Neanderthal boyfriends and girlfriends. Some people say they still do. That's a whole different story, but it comes up in my workshops all the time. So we do have Neanderthal DNA, but we did not descend from them. So if our viewers and listeners, if you're familiar with Neanderthal, you're probably also familiar with another life form that was called, in the past, was called Cro-Magnon. That term is no longer even used. It's been replaced with another term, anatomically modern human, or the acronym AMH, anatomically modern human. And this is where the story gets really interesting, even more interesting, because now we know what we're not. We are not the descendants of Australopithecus and Lucy and Neanderthal and all of those things. Cro-Magnon, or anatomically modern humans, appeared relatively suddenly on the earth. They showed up about 200,000 years ago, and there's no evolutionary path leading to their emergence. They appeared. When they appeared, they were fully human. And this is what the studies are showing now. Again, they've been able to pull the DNA from the fossilized remains of anatomically modern humans, compare them to ours today, fully modern, fully human DNA. And it means that the body proportions are the same, cranial capacity is the same, extended neural network is the same, the chromosomal arrangement is the same. And this is not Darwin's idea of evolution, slow, gradual changes over a long period of time. The anatomically modern humans showed up 200,000 years ago, and here is the kicker. They haven't changed in 200,000 years. We are the anatomically modern humans. We showed up 200,000 years ago, wired with the extraordinary nervous system and the extraordinary brain that we have today, that gives us extraordinary capabilities no other form of life have. And it was with us from the moment that we appeared. It did not evolve slowly, gradually over long periods of time. That is a problem for evolutionary biologists. Now, the scientists, when they're looking at this, then we have what is called forensic DNA. So we can look at the DNA as it is today. This is my earpiece here. We can look at the DNA as it is today, and we can now work backwards to see how the DNA came to be as it is. And this is what you're referring to, Michael. There are a number of mysteries, and I talk about them in the book. One of the biggest and the most profound is with chromosome number 2, human chromosome number 2. It's the second largest chromosome in the human body. It's about 8% of every cell. There are over 1,200 genes. So the genes are little pieces of the DNA that make the entire chromosome. Over 1,200 genes. I'm going to talk about only one of those, and it is a really profound topic. There are other profound topics as well on this chromosome, but this is a gene that's called TBR1, TBR1. And scientists believe that this is the gene that is responsible for the brain 50% larger that we have than any of our nearest primate relatives. 200,000 years ago, we showed up with this brain 50% larger. The portion is called the neocortex. And the neocortex is largely what is responsible for our uniqueness. So it's what gives us our uniquely human capacities of empathy and sympathy and compassion. And self-regulation. This is going to be, I'm going to talk about this throughout our conversation. Self-regulation, the ability that we have that no other form of life has, to sit down in a moment in time and say, in this moment, I choose to self-regulate. I choose to awaken, for example, the immune response, a powerful immune response in my body to help me through whatever is happening in my life. Or I choose to awaken my longevity enzymes for healing in my body, or I choose to create resilience in my body emotionally and physically so that I can deal in a healthy way with the change in my life. Or I choose to trigger deep states of intuition. I choose to access my subconscious mind. All of these things we can do on demand in a way no other form of life can, and it's all because of what happened in human chromosome number 2. So you're referring to the fusion, and this is where it gets even more interesting, because scientists now pretty much agree. There are a few holdouts that aren't agreeing with this, but pretty much are agreeing that human chromosome number 2 is the result of an ancient fusion of pre-existing chromosomes, separate chromosomes, into a single chromosome that makes us who we are today. And this is published in the Proceedings, National Academy of Sciences, the volume Genetics, the year 2000. So it is, this is the predominant thinking. The fusion happened in a way that does not happen in mammals. It's never been seen before. This isn't the way that that chromosomes fuse. And if that weren't enough to really tweak the interest of the biologists, it's what happened after the fusion that begins to tell the story. After the fusion happened, the resulting chromosome number 2, it was tweaked. Certain places were modified. Certain places were essentially turned off or turned on to strengthen and reduce the redundancy. If you have 2 existing chromosomes, you put them together, you're going to have overlapping functions. Those overlapping functions were shut down or turned off or removed. So this is a very streamlined, very efficient chromosome. The scientists tell us that cannot happen through evolution. And this is where it borders on what is called forbidden territory. Science says it appears there's an underlying intentionality to the fusion and the tweaking of that fusion. So if it happened only in one place, I would say, as a scientist, I would say, you know, it's pretty weird, but maybe it is through evolution, natural processes. The point here is that is not the only chromosome where this happened. Other chromosomes had similar modifications, not fusions, but modifications, and they all happened at 200,000 years ago. Chromosome number 7, perfect example. When I'm not doing what I'm doing right now, when I'm not an author, I'm not a researcher, a public speaker, I'm a musician. I have been all my life since I was 8 years old. And as a musician, Michael, I've always wondered, we share about 98% of our DNA with apes and chimpanzees. How come a chimpanzee can't sing? I mean, you're never going to hear a chimpanzee sing Stairway to Heaven. I guarantee you it's not going to happen. And the reason is because of what I'm about to say right now. 200,000 years ago, at the same time chromosome 2 was being tweaked and modified, chromosome number 7 was also going through a modification. And there are two, I think you're familiar with the DNA letters C, T, A, and G that make up the human genome. 200,000 years ago, in chromosome number 7, there was a reversal, just this little where 2 letters were reversed in a way that had not happened in primates for over 75 million years and has never been seen in any other primate. That happened with us. That reversal gave us the ability to link our tongue and the muscles in our mouth and our jaw with certain parts of our brain so that we can have complex speech and ultimately so that we can sing. So that happened, and this is through the David Geffen School of Medicine in California is documented this. The Max Planck Institute is documented this, so it's not my theory. This is what the science is telling us. The probability of all these and other things happening at exactly the same time suggests that evolution, strongly suggests evolution is not our story. Scientists now say it appears there's an intentionality, and that's where science has to stop, because science can't tell us the why. They can only tell us what happened, the nuts and bolts. Can't tell us why it happened, but if there's an intentionality, it implies a purpose. And I think this is opening the door to a new human story that closely parallels the stories of our most ancient and cherished spiritual as well as indigenous traditions. Now, those traditions aren't scientific, but the science parallels what those traditions have told us for a very long time. So this is where the science is right now. I want to talk about the implications, but I'm going to turn it over to you here, David. This is what the science is telling us right now.
It's mind-blowing because it's just overwhelming. If these changes are actually a result of an intentional act of creation, of course, raises huge, who and says, well, we're the products of some intelligence form of life.
Sure.
Well, what intelligent form of life? I mean, it really throws it wide open. And
Sure.
And how do you discover from that, the answer to those questions, or is it really even necessary to find the answer of those?
Well, I think two things are happening here. And again, I'm going to go back to the very beginning of this conversation, because this evidence changes the story. Mm-hmm. And it changes the story from being this very sterile story of life forming by accident, by a fluke of circumstances, to life being the result of some intentional process. And I'm very comfortable saying we may not understand it today. Now, I know the spiritual implications, the religious implications. I've spent the bulk of my adult life studying traditions in some of the most isolated and remote, beautiful, pristine places remaining in the world today with the indigenous peoples, with the monks and the nuns in Tibet, and the monasteries in the mountains of Egypt, and the southern Andes of Peru, and into Bolivia, and the healers and the shamans, and the curanderos, and the Yucatan, and all through the American desert Southwest, and Nepal, and India, and the Aboriginals in Australia, and more, because I believe that there's a wisdom. Science is only 300 years old. Science is a relatively new way of thinking about the world, and it's good. I think the scientific method is good, but we've got to keep science honest. And we also have to allow for the fact that science is a relatively young way of understanding our world. There are huge gaps and glaring inconsistencies in the scientific story when it comes to us and who we are. So when I go to those indigenous traditions and I ask the question, who are we? Everybody's got a story. The Aboriginals, the Aboriginals of Australia, they trace their DNA lineage, the oldest continuous lineage of humans on the face of the earth, back over 60,000 years, they can continuously trace their DNA lineage. They tell us that we are the product of a higher form of life. Their creation story actually shows the birthing process of humans coming into this world as a result of an interaction with higher forms of life. When you talk to the people, the Hindu traditions, they tell us something very similar. When you talk to in the Egyptian traditions, they tell us a similar story. The ancient Hebrew traditions tell us a very similar story. The Christian traditions tell us that we're the product of an intelligent intervention, that we're not the product. And the Christian traditions have great pictures, the paintings that go with it, you know, when you go into the cathedrals and things like that. If you watch the History Channel has a story that says, you know, alien intervention. If you study science, they've got a story that has been called evolution from primitive to more sophisticated. And now DNA has a new story that says there is an intentional modification that was made to the DNA that makes us who we are today. Mm. So it depends on who you ask, but it's interesting because all of these stories, you know, it's kind of like the story of the Great Flood. As a geologist, the geologic record shows there was a great flood about 5,000 years ago. So that's the physical evidence. The indigenous traditions all tell the story of the flood. However, they tell it from their unique perspective, where they live and what it meant to their people. So the Andes, people of the Q'ero, for example, Q'ero traditions of the Andes Mountains of Peru, they tell a different story than the Hopi. And the Hopi tell a little bit different story than the Navajo, and they tell a little bit different story from the Aboriginals, because they're all telling it from their own perspective. But the story, it's still the same story. Something very similar has happened when it comes to human origin. So where this really opens the floodgates of possibilities for me, Michael, is regardless of where this story leads, what we now know is that we are biology, the biology that gives us the potential for these extraordinary capabilities that have been relegated to mystics and monks and nuns and yogis and the healers and the shamans and the curanderos in the past, living in isolated jungles or mountaintops halfway around the world. Those abilities, those extraordinary abilities, are accessible to all of us because it shows that we have been wired for these capabilities since we appeared 200,000 years ago. Some people have taken the time to develop them to a greater extent, but we all have access to these capabilities that help us to deal with life in a healthy way. So, and once again, the better we know ourselves, the less fear we have of change in the world, because we trust ourselves in the presence of the change. The less we fear other people that we don't know, and the more willing we are to accept the power that lives within each of us. So what these new discoveries are telling us is that these capabilities of harnessing the potential between the heart and the brain and the human nervous system, the way it's wired, and creating neural links and neural expressions through mirror neurons in our bodies, and all of these kinds of things, they've been with us from the moment we appeared. It appears that they have always been part of our existence, part of our being. They've always been available to us, and that suggests that there is a purpose to our existence rather than this random, survival of the strongest. We just happen to be here and just happen to have these capabilities. And when you start to think like that, life takes on a new meaning, and we begin to regain some of the respect for life that has been lost through this very sterile sounding story, the respect for life that makes it very difficult to hurt one another and to create the suffering that has resulted from the sterile sounding story of evolution as it's been taught. Mm. So we're covering a lot of ground here. The implications in terms of society are huge. The implications for personal growth and personal development are huge. And the implications for spirituality and religious beliefs are huge as well. And I think there's a place where they all come together in a really beautiful way.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated with other cultures, and also not as much as you've been everywhere, it seems, but of the creation stories, particularly in the shamanic communities, the mystical communities, the indigenous communities, always have a creation story.
Yeah.
that they know, in not just the leaders of the tribe, but you talk about the Karo, they live inside of a story of no separation. And the impact of not having a story, or the embedded story, is more the deterministic model, mechanistic model that has us being in a dead universe. And of course, there's no wonder that we can be having wars and destroying our own habitat and all the things we do without having a powerful creation story behind us. So
Absolutely.
I think this opens that up. And one of the things you mentioned that I really don't want to pass up the opportunity to talk about is the heart-brain connection. I've been also a big follower of the heart math people, and I think you also are involved with them, and the implications of this shift in the heart-brain connection. Sure. And how that might be flipping and going the other way. I'm not saying it very scientifically, but you know what I'm talking about. Can you speak a little bit about the heart brain and how that fits into the puzzle?
Sure. Well, Michael, you just covered a lot of ground in those comments as well. So I'm going to go back and pick up on one of the first things you were talking about. You know, there was, I'm in my mid 60s now, and I've been studying, you know, these things ever since I was a child. And there was an author in the early 1960s, 1962, her name was Rachel Carson. I think some of our listeners and viewers probably remember. She
us old people know that.
Yeah, well, she was one of the first. Oh, we're just getting started. What are you kidding? We're just,
that's right. We're going to 120. I forgot.
I'm on a 200-year plan, my brother, and I'm looking forward to the changes. But Rachel Carson was one of the first really outspoken, powerful environmentalists, and as a woman, a female environmentalist. She wrote the book entitled Silent Spring, identifying the power of DDT, the role of DDT in illness and disease, and the harmful effects of this pesticide that was being used, you know, freely and openly in the 1960s. But she made a statement then that was so powerful. I remember reading it when I was a kid, and it stayed with me all of my life. And I think it applies to everything we're talking about now. And what she said was this. She said, we only destroy the things that we don't value, and we can only value what we understand. Human life is being destroyed at an unprecedented rate. And I believe it's because it has been devalued consciously as well as subconsciously through our media and our programming, and what our young people are exposed to. Human life appears to be expendable. The atrocities, whether you're talking about the unspeakable things that ISIS has been committing in the 21st century that sound medieval, or the atrocities of the hate crimes that led to the Hate Crime Prevention Act, where Congress had to make it illegal to commit these atrocities. They had to give a legal definition so that they could make it against the law to do the kinds of things that we're doing to people that had different colored skin or different sexual orientation. All of those kinds of things we only destroy the things that we don't value. And we've been conditioned that life is expendable and life has such little value. And I think this is the value of going back and revisiting the story, the human story, and learning that we're more than this random assemblage of molecules and atoms that just happened to occur a long time ago, and that we're more than this struggle of competition and conflict and dog eat dog. What the new science is actually showing is that nature is actually based upon a model of cooperation and what biologists call mutual aid. Now, we all know that competition and violence happens. We see it. I'm not denying that. But what the science is telling us is the more of that you see, the more violence, the more competition, conflict, and struggle you see, the further we have strayed from the truest law of the natural world that we're a part of. So the less harmonized we are with that natural world. And this is true for individuals, it's true for nations. And you can apply that wherever you want to apply it. But this is what the science is saying. Are we sophisticated? Absolutely. Have we evolved beyond the dependence upon the natural world? Absolutely not. And if we're going to live in harmony with the world, I think these fundamentals are key, both when it comes to human survival and when it comes to the survival of our planet. So I wanted to say that. I also want to go back. You touched upon one of the newest discoveries. Michael, was only made in 1991. So within the context of everything that we're saying, here we are, we're finding that evolution's not the human story, that we appear to be the product of a genetic modification. Now these new discoveries begin to take on an even deeper meaning. And one of those discoveries was made in 1991. Scientists discovered about 40,000 specialized cells concentrated in the human heart in a way that had not been recognized in the past. These specialized cells, they're called sensory neurites, and they're essentially brain-like cells, but they're not in the cranial brain, they're in the heart. Here's the key, that these sensory neurites, they function in a very similar way to neurons in the brain. They think independently of the cranial brain, they feel, they sense, and they remember independently of the cranial brain. And that means that we have two very different ways of knowing and interpreting our world, either through the filters of logic and fear and ego and bias and hurt and judgment that go along with the brain, or through the cells in the heart and what the indigenous people have always called the single eye of the heart, or Shante Ishta is the term that's given by the Cherokee people in North America, the single eye of the heart, Shante Ishta. Well, this opens the door, this scientific pathway to being able to embrace many of the traditions that are preserved in our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions, the power of the human heart, when it comes to intuition, when it comes to direct knowledge, when it comes to resilience, when it comes to understanding of what's happening in our lives, in the world. And that's important, but it goes even one step beyond that, because what we now know is that while these two nerve centers can function independently, and we all know that, and we're accustomed to doing that, it's possible to harmonize the heart and the brain, two separate organs, into a single system through the nervous system, heart-brain harmony, or the scientific term is called heart-brain coherence. And this is one of the key precepts of the Institute of Heart Math, for example, an organization that's based in Northern California. I am not their employee. I've been affiliated with them, and I've toured with them. I've worked with them. We've co-presented together all over the world, almost since their inception. So, I mean, it's been over 20 years. And what they have done is to refine the techniques that you see in many of the indigenous traditions, to refine those into very simple steps that we can apply in the urban world, in our daily lives, so that we can benefit from this heart-brain harmony. But again, I'm going to go back. It's only possible for us because of what happened 200,000 years ago, when we got the neocortex, human chromosome number 2, that appears to be the result of an intentional act. It gave us the ability to harmonize the heart and the brain. And that's what gives us the evolutionary edge from other forms of life. It sets us apart from other forms of life because we can consciously, remember I used the term self-regulation, we can self-regulate this harmony. We can consciously harmonize the heart and the brain on demand. Why would we want to do that? Well, this is the beginning of probably a whole different program. We could do another program on this. When we harmonize the heart and the brain, we set up a condition within the body. And from that condition, myriad possibilities emerge. So, number one, just by harmonizing the heart and the brain, we create more resilience to change in our lives. Physiologically, we're better. It has implications of blood pressure, cardiovascular system, immune response is strengthened, anti-aging enzymes are awakened just from harmonizing the heart and the brain in the way that heart math and indigenous people have learned to do. Beyond that, once we create this space, this is the space where we can consciously go into very deep states of intuition beyond spontaneous intuition and coincidences of everyday life. And this is the really deep stuff when it comes to perceiving events before they happen, precognition, for example. When it comes to understanding dreams and what dreams are saying, emotional experiences, trauma, and releasing trauma from the past, all those are possible. Direct access to the subconscious. is possible from harmonizing the heart and the brain in this way, and so much more. So what we're beginning to see is that through whatever happened 200,000 years ago, we're given the biological wiring and the emotional potential to harness this extraordinary these extraordinary abilities that we have in our bodies, and to use them to navigate a changing world in a healthy way. Now, my sense, I'm just going to bring this full circle, Michael. Scientists can't tell us precisely why the DNA was tweaked the way it was. As I mentioned, all science can do is science can identify the nuts and bolts of what has occurred, because that's concrete, that's tangible. I mean, it's right there in front of you. It's just there. Science cannot infer what precipitated those events, why those things happened. However, my sense is, and I'm going to deviate here from peer-reviewed science. This is Gregg's opinion. This is a Greggism. My sense is that as we embrace the extraordinary potential that lives within each of us, and we begin to awaken and develop those potentials and follow them to where they lead, by doing that, it's going to bring us full circle, and it will lead us to a deeper understanding of who or what is responsible for us having these capabilities. I think it is by awakening and developing the potential, that is the path to understanding why we have that potential. Comes right back to the question, who am I as an individual? Who are we collectively?
Very exciting. You know, just one more thing. I know we're close to the end of our time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about, we've alluded to aging and health. Can you speak just a little bit about the telomeres and
Sure.
the impact of them and what the body is capable of in terms of longevity?
Well, I'm going to answer the last part of your question first. What the new science is telling us is that there's absolutely no reason for the human body to stop functioning after only 70, 80, 90, or 100 years, as we typically see today. Science has documented every organ in the human body now has been scientifically documented with the ability to repair and heal itself, and tissue, even the ones we were told could not. So spinal cord tissue, brain tissue, heart tissue, pancreatic tissue, all of these and more, they're all documented with the ability to heal whatever disease they are exhibiting, and to reverse that disease. Here's the key: if they are given the right environment. The right environment. Now, when I say environment, it could be the external environment of air and food and water. That also includes the internal environment that we create through thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs. What we now know is that every thought, feeling, emotion, and belief that we have, that's what we call it, but our body produces a chemistry, and this was identified in the 1990s, when we have emotionally significant trauma, for example. I'm just going to use trauma as an example. There's a chemistry linked to traumatic experiences. They're actually called neuropeptides. And our body produces these neuropeptides in response to the experience. And if we know how to reconcile the emotions, those neuropeptides we metabolize them out through our normal processes. If we don't know how to reconcile them, our body will store these neuropeptides in very specific organs of the body until we have the ability to emotional maturity or the ability to deal with them. And if we don't deal with them, at some point, not always, but it's what we find is that they will manifest themselves as what we call disease or illness. And what that means is that these experiences are lighting up for us so that they can have the resolution that they didn't have when they occurred, maybe when we were 3 years old or 5 years old or whatever it is. So, experiences of betrayal, fear, abandonment, abuse, all of those kinds of things. So this is one of the implications. Now, you asked about the telomeres. One of the biomarkers, the biological markers for aging that scientists use are little pieces of DNA at the end of every chromosome. They're called telomeres or telomeres. I've heard them pronounced both ways. That the length of these telomeres is used as the biological marker for aging. As our cells divide, as we get older, these telomeres sometimes, it may not happen for everyone, but they typically will break off, become shorter and shorter and shorter until the cell can no longer divide and keep all of its information intact. And when that happens, we call it aging, we call it senescence, eventually we call it death. Now, I said maybe not everyone, because if you're watching this program, you are probably living your life in a way that supports the health of those telomeres: diet, exercise, nutrition, and internal environment. Thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and beliefs are now directly linked to an enzyme, and you're going to love this. The only place this enzyme is found is near the telomeres at the end of the chromosomes. In 2009, Elizabeth Blackburn and Carol Greider received the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology, I think it was, because they identified this enzyme. So the telomeres are where the action is. The name of the enzyme is telomerase. Its sole purpose is to stop the damage, so it's not damaged further on the telomere, to heal that damage, and this is where it gets really, really good, to actually begin to lengthen the telomeres, in some cases beyond where they were when they were originally, when the telomeres were originally introduced. So what this tells us is that at any age, if we give our bodies the proper conditions, we have a mechanism designed first to stop the aging process as we have come to know it, then to heal the biological markers, then to begin to build and extend and create even longer telomeres. And if you are extending the telomeres, that means that your DNA is reproducing in a healthy way. Now, I have to be really careful when I say this. Just because you make the telomeres longer doesn't necessarily mean you're going to live longer, but those people that live longer, a part of that longevity is having these telomeres lengthened. So it doesn't mean, that you can activate the telomerase on the one hand, and on the other hand, have a typical Western diet and indulge in typical Western vices and expect to live longer. So, a lot of it's common sense. But what it's telling us, and I've studied longevity, I've been with people 120, 130 plus years old in other countries. And I've been in cultures, Michael, where people achieve the age 100, 110, 120. Alzheimer's is not even in their society. They don't have the cancers. You don't see breast cancer. You don't see prostate cancer. And what that tells me is it's not about the age. It's about how we live our lives as we attain the age. And the science is now giving us new insights into what this means for us and how we can apply it in our lives. So to me, this is all good news. And it gives us a new way to answer the question when we say, who am I as an individual? Who are we collectively? We're not what we've been told in the past. And I think we're more than we've ever imagined. And the better we know ourselves, the less we fear the change and the less we fear that power that we have within us to embrace these extraordinary capabilities. So that's a new human story.
Well, Gregg Braden, I know we're out of time. So much wonderful information. I want to plug your book, Human by Design, From Evolution by Chance to Transformation by Choice. I am just so grateful to have you and sharing the wisdom that you've gathered from a life of exploration. And I look forward to seeing you soon, perhaps over in Nanaimo in a few weeks, or next month, I guess.
Next month, Science and Spirituality Conference, Bruce Lipton, Joe Dispenza, Lee Carroll, Lynn McTaggart, some guy named Gregg Braden. We're all going to be together. It'll probably never happen again. It took us 3 years to get our schedules together, and people are saying, well, maybe we'll catch you next time. Well, I don't know if this is ever going to happen again. And it's so, Michael, it's been so hugely successful. They've just actually gone to a larger venue space.
Oh, good.
To accommodate the interest. So I'm looking forward. Please come and say hello. Michael, if you're there, listeners, if you're there, I look forward to see, I'll be doing a book signing. Come say hi. And Michael, I like your new video format. Thank you for making this possible today.
Oh, great. Thank you, my friend.
You're
Many
welcome.
blessings.
Take good care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.